Sarah Martinez had always been quiet about her past. At 28, she worked as a data analyst at the Department of Defense, spending her days behind a computer screen reviewing logistics reports and supply chain data. Her colleagues saw her as the shy woman who ate lunch alone, wore simple clothes, and never talked about weekends or hobbies. What they didn't know was that Sarah had grown up on a ranch in Montana, where her grandfather had taught her to shoot before she could properly tie her shoes. The invitation to the annual interdepartmental marksmanship competition came as a surprise to everyone in Sarah's office. Major Robert Hammond, a decorated Army officer who oversaw their division, announced it during the monthly staff meeting with his usual commanding presence. "This year's competition will be held at Fort Myer," Major Hammond declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "We need representatives from each department. It's not mandatory, but it would show good spirit." Sarah watched as her male colleagues immediately began discussing who should participate. David from accounting boasted about his hunting trips. Mike from procurement mentioned his time at the local gun range. Tom from logistics talked about his father's military service and how shooting ran in his family. "What about you, Sarah?" asked Jennifer, the only other woman in the department. "Do you want to sign up?" The room fell silent. Major Hammond looked at Sarah with barely concealed amusement. At 5 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulder-length brown hair usually pulled back in a simple ponytail, Sarah didn't fit anyone's image of a marksman. "I appreciate the suggestion," Major Hammond said with a condescending smile, "but this is a serious competition. We're representing the entire Department of Defense. These events can be quite intense, and marksmanship requires significant upper body strength and steady nerves." Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice steady. "I'd like to participate, sir." Major Hammond's eyebrows rose. "Miss Martinez, have you ever fired a weapon before?" "Yes, sir. A few times at a carnival shooting gallery doesn't really count," he said, earning chuckles from several of her colleagues. "This competition uses military-grade rifles. The targets are at distances most civilians can't even see clearly." Sarah felt something stir inside her that she hadn't felt in years. It was the same feeling she'd had when boys at school said girls couldn't ride bulls, or when her college professors suggested she might be better suited for a different major than mechanical engineering. "I understand, sir. I'd still like to compete." Major Hammond studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Very well. But I want you to understand that this reflects on all of us. The other departments will have their best shooters. Military veterans, police officers, people who've been training for years. I understand the stakes, sir. Do you even own appropriate gear? This isn't a casual event. You'll need proper shooting attire, eye protection, ear protection. The rifle alone weighs 8 pounds before you add the scope and bipod." Sarah nodded. "I'll be prepared." After the meeting, Sarah's colleagues offered their advice. Most of it was well-intentioned but revealed their own assumptions about her capabilities. "Maybe you should practice at the indoor range downtown," suggested David. "Start with a small caliber pistol to get used to the recoil." "I have some old Army manuals you could borrow," offered Mike. "Basic marksmanship principles, breathing techniques, that sort of thing." Tom was more direct. "Sarah, I don't want to discourage you, but Major Hammond is right. This is serious business. Maybe you should consider being a scorekeeper instead? That's just as important." Sarah thanked them all politely but didn't take their advice. Instead, she went home to her small apartment and opened a closet she rarely used. Inside, carefully stored in climate-controlled cases, was equipment that most of her colleagues couldn't have identified correctly. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory as she ran her hands over the custom rifle stocks. "Shooting isn't about being the biggest or strongest, Sarah. It's about understanding yourself, understanding your weapon, and respecting both." Jack Martinez had been a legend in competitive shooting circles, though he'd never boasted about it. 3-time national champion, holder of multiple state records, and coach to Olympic hopefuls. He'd taught Sarah that true marksmanship was equal parts mental discipline, physical consistency, and emotional control. The next morning, Sarah requested a personal day and drove 3 hours to a private range outside the city. The facility was owned by an old friend of her grandfather's, a former Marine named Eddie Kowalski who'd competed alongside Jack in the 1970s. "Well, I'll be damned," Eddie said when Sarah walked into the range office. "You look just like your grandfather did at that age. Haven't seen you since the funeral. How long has it been?" "4 years," Sarah replied. "I've been busy with work." "Too busy to shoot?" "Too busy to compete. But I've been practicing when I can get away." Eddie's weathered face broke into a grin. "Let me guess. Some hotshot military boy thinks you can't handle a rifle?" "Something like that. Your grandfather would have loved this. He always said the biggest mistake his competitors made was underestimating quiet people." Eddie gestured toward the range. "Let's see what you remember." Sarah spent the day reacquainting herself with equipment she'd been using since childhood, but in a more serious context than weekend practice sessions. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, the weight distribution exactly what her muscle memory expected. Her breathing fell into the rhythm her grandfather had taught her, and her heartbeat slowed to the controlled pace that had once made her nearly unbeatable in junior competitions. "Your groupings are tight," Eddie observed after she'd put 50 rounds through a target at 400 yards. "But you're holding back. There's hesitation in your follow-through." Sarah knew he was right. She'd spent so many years hiding this part of herself that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to shoot with complete confidence. "What's the competition format?" Eddie asked. "I'm not sure." Major Hammond said it was military-grade rifles at long distance. "Probably M24 sniper weapon system." Standard Army competition setup would be prone position, supported shooting, multiple distances starting at 300 yards and going out to 800. 5 shots per string, multiple strings to determine overall score. Sarah nodded. She'd competed in similar formats before, though never while representing a government department where her colleagues expected her to fail. "What's eating at you?" Eddie asked. "You're technically sound, but your head's not in the right place." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I've spent 4 years being someone else. Being the quiet office worker who doesn't make waves. I'm not sure I remember how to be the person who wins competitions. Your grandfather used to say that shooting reveals character. You can't fake consistency under pressure. Either you have the discipline or you don't." Eddie paused. "But he also said that sometimes you have to choose who you want to be. The question is whether you're willing to deal with the consequences of people seeing who you really are." That evening, Sarah researched the competition format and confirmed Eddie's guess. The interdepartmental marksmanship competition would indeed use M24 rifles, with scoring based on precision at distances from 300 to 800 yards. The format was designed to test skills that military snipers would need in the field. She also learned more about Major Hammond's background. His military record was impressive but focused on leadership and logistics rather than specialized skills like marksmanship. He'd served with distinction in administrative roles, earning his reputation through efficient management of complex operations rather than battlefield expertise. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. The man who'd questioned her ability to handle a military rifle had likely fired one far less frequently than she had. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah maintained her usual routine at work while secretly preparing for the competition. She visited Eddie's range 3 more times, fine-tuning her technique and rebuilding the mental focus that had once made her nearly unbeatable. Her colleagues occasionally asked about her preparation, usually with the assumption that she was struggling with basics. "How's the shooting practice going?" David asked one morning. "Are you getting used to the noise?" "It's going well," Sarah replied simply. "I heard the M24 has a pretty strong kick," Mike added. "You might want to practice with something that has similar recoil so you don't get surprised." Sarah nodded politely, not mentioning that she'd been shooting rifles with greater recoil than the M24 since she was 15. Major Hammond occasionally made comments that seemed designed to give her an opportunity to withdraw gracefully from the competition. Miss Martinez, I want you to know that there's no shame in deciding this isn't the right fit, he said one afternoon. I'd rather have you bow out now than struggle in front of representatives from other departments. I appreciate your concern, sir, but I'm committed to participating. I admire your determination, he replied, though his tone suggested he thought determination wouldn't be enough. The night before the competition, Sarah packed her grandfather's equipment bag with the same care she'd learned as a child. Each piece had its place, each tool had been maintained to exacting standards. The ritual of preparation was as important as the shooting itself. She'd kept her grandfather's competition journal, a leather-bound notebook where he'd recorded every match, every lesson learned, every adjustment that had improved his performance. His final entry, written just months before his death, included advice that seemed particularly relevant now. The hardest competitions aren't against other shooters, he'd written. They're against people's expectations of who you are and what you're capable of. The rifle doesn't care about your reputation. It only responds to consistency, discipline, and respect. Trust your training, trust your equipment, and trust yourself. Everything else is just noise. Sarah closed the journal and set her alarm. Tomorrow, she would find out whether 4 years of hiding her abilities had dulled them beyond recovery, or whether her grandfather's training ran deep enough to survive anything. The morning of the competition dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp October air that made long-distance shooting ideal. Sarah arrived at Fort Myer an hour before the scheduled start time, carrying her equipment bag and wearing clothing that surprised her colleagues who were already gathering in the parking lot. Gone was the typical office attire of blouses and dress pants. Instead, Sarah wore military-style cargo pants, a fitted shooting jacket, and boots that looked broken and rather than purchased for the occasion. Her hair was pulled back in a tight braid that wouldn't interfere with her cheek weld, and she carried herself with a confidence that seemed at odds with the quiet data analyst her colleagues knew. "Sarah?" David called out uncertainly. "You look different." "Professional shooting gear," she replied simply, hefting her equipment bag with an ease that suggested it wasn't as heavy as it looked. Major Hammond approached with several other department heads, all military men who carried themselves with the bearing of people accustomed to command. His expression shifted slightly when he saw Sarah's transformation, but he quickly covered his surprise with professional courtesy. "Miss Martinez, I see you've come prepared. That's good military bearing." He gestured to the other officers. "These are the department heads who'll be observing today. Colonel Peterson from Intelligence, Major Davis from Communications, and Lieutenant Colonel Brooks from Strategic Planning." Sarah shook hands with each man, noting their appraising looks. She was clearly not what they'd expected from Major Hammond's department. "Have you had a chance to familiarize yourself with the M24 system?" asked Colonel Peterson, his tone neutral but probing. "I have some experience with similar platforms," Sarah replied. "Similar meaning what, exactly?" pressed Lieutenant Colonel Brooks. "Hunting rifles? Sporting rifles?" "Precision rifles," Sarah answered without elaborating. The competition format was explained by Master Sergeant Riley, a career Army marksman who served as the range safety officer. 24 competitors representing 8 different departments would fire in groups of 4. Each shooter would engage targets at 300, 500, and 800 yards, with 5 shots per distance. The highest combined score would determine the winner. The M24 sniper weapon system fires the 7.62 by 51 mm NATO round, Master Sergeant Riley announced to the assembled competitors. "Each rifle has been zeroed to match military specifications, but you'll have the opportunity to fire 3 practice rounds at each distance to confirm your point of impact." Sarah was assigned to the third group, along with David from her own department, a police detective named Rodriguez from the Justice Department, and Staff Sergeant Williams, an active duty soldier representing the Personnel Department. As the first group took their positions, Sarah watched carefully. The course was set up exactly as Eddie had predicted, with shooting positions clearly marked and targets that looked almost impossibly small at the longer distances. The 800-yard targets appeared as tiny dots even through the rifle scopes. The first competitor, a former Marine representing the Treasury Department, fired a respectable group but dropped several points at the longest distance. The second shooter, a National Guard officer, struggled with wind calls and scored poorly at 500 yards. By the end of the first group, the highest score was 187 out of a possible 225 points. "Not bad for the opening round," commented Major Hammond, who was keeping unofficial score. "Though I suspect some of the later groups will do better as they learn from watching the wind conditions." The second group included 2 more former military personnel and a civilian contractor who claimed to be a competitive shooter. Their scores ranged from 165 to 201, with the contractor setting the new high mark by reading the wind conditions better than the others. 201 is a solid score, observed Colonel Peterson. "That'll be hard to beat without exceptional skill." When Sarah's group was called to the line, she carried her equipment bag to the firing position and began her preparation routine. The other competitors were already examining their assigned rifles, checking the scope settings and getting familiar with the triggers. Sarah's approach was different. She spent several minutes simply observing the wind indicators downrange, watching the grass move and the mirage patterns that would affect bullet flight. Only then did she pick up her assigned rifle and begin her equipment check. "Thorough preparation," noted Master Sergeant Riley approvingly. "That's good fieldcraft." The rifle felt foreign in her hands at first, different from her grandfather's custom weapons but similar enough that the fundamentals remained the same. Sarah adjusted the stock length, checked the scope clarity, and settled into a comfortable shooting position. "Shooters, you have 3 practice rounds at 300 yards, announced Master Sergeant Riley. "Make them count." Sarah's first practice shot hit the target 2 inches high and 1 inch right of center. She made a mental note of the adjustment needed and fired her second round, which struck within an inch of the bullseye. Her third practice round was a perfect center hit. "Nice shooting," said Staff Sergeant Williams, who was positioned next to her. "You've definitely handled a rifle before." "A few times," Sarah replied, already calculating wind drift for the 500-yard line. The formal competition began with Sarah firing fourth in the rotation. David went first, managing a respectable group that scored 36 points out of 50. Detective Rodriguez followed with 41 points, showing solid police marksmanship training. Staff Sergeant Williams posted 43 points, the best score so far. Sarah settled into her shooting position and controlled her breathing the way her grandfather had taught her. The rifle scope brought the 300-yard target into sharp focus, the bullseye clearly defined against the white target backing. Her first shot was a perfect center hit. The second followed within a quarter inch. The third, fourth, and fifth shots created a group so tight that the observers needed binoculars to confirm all 5 rounds had indeed been fired. 50 points, announced Master Sergeant Riley, his voice carrying a note of surprise. Perfect score at 300 yards. Major Hammond's expression had changed from polite interest to focused attention. A perfect score at 300 yards was unusual but not unheard of. The real test would come at the longer distances where wind, elevation changes, and bullet drop made precision exponentially more difficult. The 500-yard line required a completely different set of calculations. Sarah spent several minutes studying the wind flags and mirage, making mental notes about wind direction changes that had developed since the earlier groups had fired. Staff Sergeant Williams fired first at this distance, posting a solid 45 points despite struggling with wind calls on his last 2 shots. Detective Rodriguez managed 39 points, and David dropped to 32 points as the longer distance exposed weaknesses in his shooting technique. Sarah's approach to the 500-yard targets was methodical. She fired her first shot and waited for the spotter's call, confirming her wind correction was accurate. The round struck dead center. She repeated the process 4 more times, each shot following the exact same routine. "Another 50 points," Master Sergeant Riley announced, his voice now carrying genuine amazement. "That's a perfect 100 points through 500 yards." The observation area had grown quiet. Word was spreading among the other competitors and department heads that something unusual was happening. Colonel Peterson had moved closer to the firing line, watching Sarah's technique with the keen interest of someone who understood the difficulty of what she was accomplishing. "Exceptional shooting," he commented to Major Hammond. "Where did you say Miss Martinez learned to handle a rifle?" Major Hammond looked uncomfortable. She mentioned having some experience, but she's primarily a data analyst. I had no idea she possessed this level of skill. The 800-yard line represented the ultimate test of marksmanship skill. At that distance, a target that measured 10 inches across looked like a small coin through the rifle scope. Wind drift could push bullets several inches off target, and the slightest error in range estimation or trigger control would result in a complete miss. Sarah took extra time preparing for the 800-yard shots. She studied every wind indicator she could see, calculated bullet drop and drift, and adjusted her shooting position to account for the uneven ground. The routine she followed was so systematic and professional that Master Sergeant Riley found himself studying her technique. "Military training?" he asked quietly. "Family training," Sarah replied, settling behind the rifle for her first shot. The 800-yard targets required a different mental approach. Sarah had learned from her grandfather that extreme long-range shooting was as much about reading conditions as it was about marksmanship fundamentals. Every environmental factor had to be considered and compensated for. Her first shot struck the target ring for 9 points, just outside perfect center. She made a slight windage adjustment and fired again, scoring a perfect 10. The third shot was another 10, followed by a fourth shot that again scored 9 points as wind conditions shifted slightly. Sarah paused before her final shot, watching the wind flags and waiting for the conditions to return to what she'd experienced on her perfect shots. The wait stretched to nearly a minute, testing her patience and the observer's nerves. When the wind calmed, Sarah fired her final shot. The bullet struck dead center for a perfect 10. 48 points at 800 yards, Master Sergeant Riley announced. Total score, 198 points out of 225. The silence that followed was broken by spontaneous applause from the other competitors. A score of 198 was exceptional by any standard, but what impressed the military observers most was the systematic, professional way Sarah had achieved it. "Outstanding marksmanship," said Colonel Peterson, approaching Sarah as she cleared her rifle. "That's military sniper-level performance. Where did you develop those skills?" Sarah was packing her equipment when she noticed the change in how everyone was looking at her. The quiet data analyst who'd been dismissed as an enthusiastic amateur was gone, replaced by someone who'd just demonstrated world-class shooting ability. "My grandfather taught me," she said simply. Major Hammond's expression had shifted from skeptical tolerance to something approaching respect mixed with embarrassment. He'd publicly questioned whether Sarah could even handle the rifle she'd just used to post one of the highest scores anyone present had ever witnessed. "Miss Martinez," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. I clearly misjudged your capabilities." Sarah nodded politely but didn't respond immediately. There were still 3 more groups of competitors to shoot, and, while her score would be difficult to beat, the competition wasn't officially over. As the remaining groups took their turns, it became clear that Sarah's performance was indeed exceptional. The closest any other competitor came to her score was 184 points, achieved by a former Army sniper who admitted afterward that he hadn't maintained his skills at their peak level. When the final results were announced, Sarah's victory was decisive. Her 198-point performance hadn't just won the competition, it had redefined what the observers thought was possible for a civilian competitor. The awards ceremony took place in the base conference room, with department heads gathered around tables laden with coffee and sandwiches. Sarah found herself seated at the head table next to senior officers who treated her with a respect she'd never experienced in her government work. "Miss Martinez," said Brigadier General Thompson, the base commander who'd arrived to present the awards, "Master Sergeant Riley tells me your performance today was truly exceptional. A score of 198 out of 225 represents marksmanship that rivals our best military snipers." Sarah accepted the trophy with quiet dignity, a simple bronze figure of a rifleman mounted on a wooden base. More meaningful than the award itself was the change she saw in everyone's faces. The same people who'd dismissed her capabilities that morning now looked at her with curiosity and genuine professional interest. "I have to ask," continued General Thompson, "what's your background? That level of precision doesn't happen by accident." "My grandfather was Jack Martinez," Sarah replied. "He taught me to shoot when I was young." The name drew immediate recognition from several of the military officers present. Colonel Peterson leaned forward with obvious interest.
Jack Martinez from Montana? The competitive shooter? You knew him? I knew of him. His reputation in precision rifle circles was legendary. Three-time national champion, holder of multiple long-range records. Colonel Peterson paused. I had no idea he had family in government service.
Sarah felt the familiar mix of pride and sadness that came whenever her grandfather's achievements were recognized. He'd been gone 4 years, but his influence on her life remained as strong as ever. He always said shooting was about more than just hitting targets, she said. It was about discipline, patience, and understanding yourself. Major Hammond, who'd been notably quiet during the ceremony, finally spoke up. Miss Martinez, I want to publicly acknowledge that I made assumptions about your abilities that were completely unfounded. Your performance today was exemplary, and I apologize for any doubt I expressed about your participation. The apology was gracious, but Sarah could see the discomfort behind it. Major Hammond was a good officer who prided himself on accurate assessment of personnel capabilities. Having so completely misjudged someone under his command was clearly bothering him. No apology necessary, sir, Sarah replied diplomatically. I understand that my background isn't immediately obvious. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself surrounded by competitors and observers who wanted to discuss technique, equipment, and training methods. The conversations were unlike any she'd experienced in her government career, focused on shared expertise rather than office hierarchy. Staff Sergeant Williams was particularly interested in her wind reading techniques. At 800 yards, I was struggling to read the mirage patterns. You seem to have no trouble with conditions that changed constantly. My grandfather taught me to watch everything, Sarah explained. Wind flags give you direction, but grass movement tells you about intensity. Mirage shows you what's happening in the middle distance, and you have to factor in all of it together. Detective Rodriguez joined the conversation, clearly impressed by what he'd witnessed. I've been shooting competitively for 15 years, and I've never seen someone read wind conditions that accurately. What's your secret? Sarah smiled. Practice and patience. My grandfather used to make me predict wind speed and direction before I was allowed to touch a rifle. He said understanding the environment was more important than understanding the weapon. The technical discussions continued for over an hour, with Sarah finding herself in the unexpected position of being sought out for advice by experienced shooters who'd previously seen her as an amateur. The transformation was complete but still felt strange. As the group began to disperse, Colonel Peterson approached Sarah with a business card and an unexpected proposition. Miss Martinez, I hope you won't mind my asking, but have you ever considered applying your skills in a more official capacity? What do you mean, sir? The Army has training programs for civilian marksmanship instructors. We're always looking for people who can teach advanced techniques to our sniper candidates. Your performance today, combined with your grandfather's reputation, suggests you might have valuable knowledge to share. Sarah studied the business card. The offer was intriguing but also complicated. She'd spent 4 years carefully maintaining a low profile, avoiding attention that might lead to questions about her past or expectations about her future. It would be part-time instruction, Colonel Peterson continued. Weekend seminars, mostly. The pay is good, and you'd be working with some of our most motivated soldiers. I'll consider it, Sarah said honestly. Can I contact you next week? Absolutely. Take your time to think it over. The drive back to her apartment gave Sarah time to process the day's events. In 8 hours, she'd gone from being the quiet data analyst who was expected to struggle with military equipment to being personally recruited by a senior Army officer. The change was dramatic enough to be disorienting. Her phone rang as she pulled into her parking space. The caller ID showed Eddie Kowalski's number. I heard through the grapevine that you won some kind of military shooting competition today, Eddie said without preamble. Word travels fast in the shooting community. News travels that quickly? When someone posts a 198 out of 225 at a government competition, people talk.
especially when that someone happens to be Jack Martinez's granddaughter. Eddie's voice carried obvious pride. Your grandfather would have been bursting with pride today. Sarah felt tears threaten for the first time all day. The competition itself had been challenging but manageable. The emotional weight of honoring her grandfather's memory while stepping back into a world she'd hidden from was more difficult to handle. He always said that shooting reveals character, Sarah said. I think today I figured out what he meant. So what happens now? You can't go back to pretending you don't know which end of a rifle the bullets come out of. I don't know. Everything feels different now. Different how? Sarah considered the question while walking up to her apartment. This morning I was someone who kept her head down and did her job quietly. Tonight I'm someone who military officers want to recruit as an instructor. I'm not sure how to be that person. You've always been that person, Eddie replied. You just forgot for a while. The question is whether you're ready to stop hiding. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with Colonel Peterson's business card and a decision to make. Teaching military snipers would mean stepping fully back into the world of precision shooting that had defined her youth. It would also mean acknowledging publicly that she possessed skills that most of her government colleagues couldn't imagine. She pulled out her grandfather's competition journal and read through entries from his coaching years, when he'd worked with Olympic hopefuls and military trainees. His philosophy about teaching was as methodical as his approach to shooting. A good instructor doesn't just teach technique, he'd written. They teach students to understand their own capabilities and limitations. The goal isn't to create copies of yourself, but to help people become the best versions of themselves. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer, her colleague who'd initially suggested she enter the competition. Heard you won the whole thing. Everyone's talking about it. Coffee tomorrow to celebrate? The message was followed by several others from colleagues who'd learned about her victory. David wanted to know if she'd teach him better wind reading techniques. Mike asked if she'd consider joining his weekend hunting group. Tom requested advice about rifle purchases for his teenage son. The attention was flattering but also overwhelming. Sarah had grown comfortable with anonymity, with being underestimated and overlooked. The prospect of being seen as an expert in anything felt foreign after 4 years of deliberate invisibility. She opened her laptop and began researching the Army's civilian instructor programs. The requirements were straightforward, demonstrated expertise, background clearance, and willingness to work with military personnel. The compensation was generous, and the schedule would allow her to maintain her regular job. More importantly, the program description emphasized the same values her grandfather had taught her: precision, discipline, patience, and respect for the responsibility that came with advanced marksmanship skills. As midnight approached, Sarah made her decision. She composed an email to Colonel Peterson expressing interest in the instructor program and requesting more detailed information about requirements and expectations. Before sending the email, she walked to her closet and looked at her grandfather's equipment one more time. The rifles and accessories represented decades of dedication to excellence in a field that demanded perfection. They also represented a legacy that she'd been honored to inherit but had been too afraid to fully embrace. Time to stop hiding, she said quietly, echoing Eddie's words from earlier. Sarah sent the email and, then, spent another hour updating her resume to reflect competitive shooting achievements she'd omitted from her government applications. The document that emerged painted a picture of someone with capabilities far beyond data analysis and report writing. Champion junior shooter at state and regional levels. Trained under Jack Martinez, 3-time national champion. Experienced in precision rifle techniques, environmental reading, and advanced marksmanship theory. Capable of consistent sub-MOA accuracy at distances exceeding 800 yards. The resume felt honest in a way her previous versions hadn't. For 4 years, she'd presented herself as someone competent but unremarkable, hoping to avoid the complications that came with standing out. Tonight, she was choosing to be seen for who she really was. Her final act before bed was to text Eddie with a simple message: "You were right. Time to stop hiding." His response came within minutes: "Your grandfather always said you'd figure it out when you were ready." Proud of you, kid. Sarah set her alarm for the usual time, knowing that tomorrow would bring the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She'd entered the competition to prove a point about underestimation and ended up rediscovering a part of herself she'd forgotten she missed. The quiet data analyst wasn't disappearing entirely, but she was about to be joined by someone her colleagues had never imagined could exist, the granddaughter of a shooting legend who'd inherited not just his skills, but his understanding that true expertise carried the responsibility to share knowledge with others who were ready to learn. 6 months later, Sarah stood at the edge of the Army sniper training range at Fort Benning, watching a group of soldiers struggle with wind calculations at 600 yards. The morning Georgia heat was creating mirage patterns that made accurate shooting challenging even for experienced marksmen. Instructor Martinez called Sergeant First Class Johnson, the lead training NCO. The students are having trouble reading conditions at this distance. Can you demonstrate the technique you mentioned yesterday? Sarah had been working as a civilian marksmanship instructor for 3 months, teaching advanced precision techniques to Army sniper candidates and experienced marksmen seeking to improve their skills. The transition from hidden data analyst to recognized expert had been smoother than she'd expected, largely because the military valued competence over office politics. Before I demonstrate, Sarah told the assembled soldiers, I want someone to walk me through what you're seeing downrange. Don't guess. Tell me specifically what environmental indicators you're observing. Specialist Brooks, a young soldier from Texas who'd been struggling with long-range precision, raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, I can see the flags are showing wind from the left, but the grass movement seems different, and the mirage is confusing. Good observation. What makes the mirage confusing? It's moving in different directions at different ranges. Like the wind conditions aren't consistent across the distance to the target. Exactly right, Sarah confirmed. That's why you can't rely on just one indicator. Specialist Martinez, what else are you seeing? The young soldier studied the range carefully. The mirage near the 300-yard mark is moving differently than the mirage at 500 yards. And the trees behind the targets are moving more than the grass near the firing line. Outstanding. You're learning to read the environment as a system rather than looking at individual pieces. Sarah picked up the training rifle, a military M24 identical to the one she'd used in the competition that had changed her life. The key is understanding that wind conditions change constantly, and you have to time your shots for moments when the conditions match your calculations. Sarah settled into a prone shooting position that the soldiers had seen her use dozens of times over the past weeks. Her approach was methodical and unhurried, demonstrating the systematic preparation that had impressed Master Sergeant Riley months earlier. Wind from the left at approximately 8 miles per hour, she announced as she studied the downrange indicators. Stronger at mid-range, lighter near the target. I'm going to hold for the average conditions and time my shot for when the mirage indicates consistent wind speed. The soldiers watched in fascination as Sarah waited nearly 30 seconds before firing, her finger on the trigger but her focus entirely on reading environmental conditions. When she finally fired, the bullet struck dead center in the target's bullseye. Perfect shot, ma'am, called out Private Chen, a former police officer who joined the Army seeking advanced training. How did you know when to fire? Experience and patience, Sarah replied, clearing the rifle and making it safe. My grandfather taught me that rushed shots are usually wasted shots. It's better to wait for the right conditions than to force a shot when the environment isn't cooperating. The training day continued with individual instruction as each soldier worked to apply the techniques Sarah had demonstrated. Her teaching style emphasized understanding over memorization, encouraging students to develop their own environmental reading skills rather than simply following formulas. During the lunch break, Sergeant First Class Johnson approached Sarah with news that would once again change her trajectory. Ma'am, I just got off the phone with Colonel Peterson. He wants to discuss expanding your role in the program. What kind of expansion? Full curriculum development. The Army is implementing new advanced marksmanship training standards, and they want you to design the environmental reading portion of the course. Sarah considered the implications while watching her students practice the morning's lessons. Curriculum development would mean greater responsibility, higher visibility, and permanent association with military training programs.
It was a significant step beyond the part-time instruction she'd been doing.
What would that involve specifically?
Creating training materials, standardizing instruction methods, possibly traveling to different bases to train other instructors. Colonel Peterson said they want to build the program around the techniques your grandfather developed. The mention of her grandfather's methods carried special weight. Jack Martinez's approach to precision shooting had been decades ahead of its time, emphasizing environmental understanding and mental discipline over equipment-focused solutions.
Sarah had been the primary keeper of his methods since his death. "I'll need to think about it," Sarah said. "That's a much bigger commitment than weekend instruction." Colonel Peterson expected you'd want time to consider it. He's scheduling a meeting for next week to discuss details. That evening, Sarah called Eddie Kowalski to discuss the opportunity.
His perspective had been valuable during her transition from hidden analyst to recognized instructor, and she trusted his judgment about the shooting community. "Sounds like they want to make your grandfather's methods part of official Army doctrine," Eddie observed after Sarah explained the proposal.
"That's quite an honor. It's also a huge responsibility.
If I design curriculum that trains military snipers, I'm directly influencing their effectiveness in combat situations. Your grandfather trained Olympic athletes and military personnel for 30 years. He understood the responsibility that comes with teaching precision skills. The question is whether you're ready for that same responsibility."
Sarah had been asking herself the same question for weeks. Teaching weekend seminars to volunteers was different from developing official training programs that would affect military readiness.
The stakes were higher, and the expectations were greater.
"There's something else," Sarah continued. "I'd have to leave my data analyst position.
This would become my full-time career."
"And that bothers you?" "I've been a government data analyst for 6 years.
It's stable, predictable, low stress.
This would be completely different."
Eddie was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, you're describing the person you were, not the person you've become. Since that competition 6 months ago, you've been more engaged and confident than I've seen since your grandfather died.
You're finally using abilities that you spent 4 years pretending you didn't have."
The conversation continued for another hour, with Eddie helping Sarah work through the implications of accepting or declining the curriculum development offer. By the end of the call, her decision was clearer but still not final.
The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Sarah's apartment.
Major Hammond knocked on her door at 7 o'clock, wearing civilian clothes and carrying coffee from her favorite local shop. "I hope you don't mind the early visit," he said when Sarah answered the door. "I heard about the Army's offer, and I wanted to discuss it before you made your decision."
Sarah invited him in, surprised by the informal nature of his visit.
Over the past 6 months, their professional relationship had evolved from his initial skepticism to genuine respect, but this was their first interaction outside the office environment. "I owe you another apology," Major Hammond began. "Not just for underestimating your abilities, but for creating an environment where you felt you had to hide them."
Sarah was surprised by his directness.
"I chose to keep my background private."
"That wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? Look at how I reacted when you wanted to compete."
"I made assumptions based on appearance and office behavior rather than taking time to learn about your actual capabilities."
Major Hammond paused.
"I've been thinking about that mistake for months."
"What's your point, sir?"
"My point is that the Army's offer represents an opportunity for you to use your full abilities in a way that our department never could.
You've outgrown what we can offer, and I think you know it."
The conversation that followed was unlike any Sarah had experienced with a supervisor. Major Hammond acknowledged that her skills were wasted in data analysis and encouraged her to accept the military instructor position, even though losing her would complicate his department's operations. "You've been hiding extraordinary abilities in an ordinary job," he said. "That's a disservice to yourself and to the people who could benefit from learning what you know."
After Major Hammond left, Sarah spent the day reviewing the official proposal from Colonel Peterson.
The curriculum development position would involve creating comprehensive training materials for environmental reading and advanced marksmanship techniques. The salary was significantly higher than her current government position, and the work would directly utilize knowledge that had been accumulating and used for years. More importantly, the position description emphasized the same philosophy her grandfather had always preached, that advanced marksmanship was about developing the whole person, not just improving shooting scores. Sarah made her decision that afternoon and called Colonel Peterson to accept the position.
"Outstanding," Colonel Peterson replied.
"I was hoping you'd see the opportunity this represents.
"When can you start full-time?"
"I'll need to give 2 weeks' notice to Major Hammond, but I can begin part-time curriculum planning immediately."
"Perfect. I'll have the paperwork started today."
The transition from data analyst to military instructor happened faster than Sarah had anticipated. Within a month, she was working full-time at Fort Benning, developing training programs that would eventually be used across the Army's sniper training facilities. Her first major project was creating a standardized environmental reading curriculum that could be taught consistently by different instructors at different locations. The challenge was translating techniques that her grandfather had taught through hands-on mentorship into classroom materials that could be used by instructors who'd never met him. Sarah spent weeks reviewing her grandfather's competition journals, extracting principles that could be systematized without losing their effectiveness. She also interviewed Olympic coaches and military instructors who'd learned from him, gathering insights about his teaching methods that she'd been too young to fully appreciate during her own training. The resulting curriculum manual became a comprehensive guide to environmental factors affecting precision shooting, covering everything from basic wind reading to advanced atmospheric effects on bullet flight. More importantly, it emphasized the mental discipline and systematic observation skills that had been the foundation of her grandfather's approach. 6 months after accepting the position, Sarah found herself briefing senior Army leadership about the new training program's effectiveness. The data was impressive. Soldiers trained using her curriculum showed measurably better performance in environmental conditions, and their skills transferred more effectively to field situations. The key insight, Sarah explained to a room full of colonels and generals, is that environmental reading is a learned skill that requires systematic development, not an intuitive ability that some people have and others don't.
When we teach soldiers to observe and interpret environmental indicators methodically, their shooting accuracy improves dramatically.
After the briefing, General Thompson approached Sarah with yet another opportunity that would have seemed impossible during her data analyst days. "Miss Martinez, we've had inquiries from Allied military forces about your training methods.
Would you be interested in developing international instructor programs?"
Sarah looked at the business card he handed her, which listed contact information for military training coordinators in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. The opportunity to share her grandfather's methods with international military forces was both exciting and daunting.
"I'd be very interested," she replied. "What would that involve?"
"Teaching instructors from Allied forces who would then implement your methods in their own training programs. It would mean travel, but also the chance to influence precision shooting training on a global scale." As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from hiding her abilities to being recruited for international military training programs. The transformation had begun with a simple decision to enter a marksmanship competition despite being underestimated and dismissed. Now, 18 months later, she was developing training curricula that would influence military precision shooting for years to come, carrying forward her grandfather's legacy in ways that honored both his memory and her own growth as an instructor and professional. The quiet data analyst still existed within her, but she was now balanced by the confident expert who understood that some abilities were too valuable to keep hidden, and some knowledge was too important not to share with others ready to learn. Her grandfather had been right about shooting revealing character. It had taken her years to understand that the character being revealed was her own capacity to step beyond comfortable limitations and accept the responsibilities that came with exceptional skills and knowledge.
The phone call from Eddie Kowalski that evening brought the perfect ending to a day of new opportunities.
"I heard through the military grapevine that you're going international with your training programs," he said. "Your grandfather would be proud beyond words. I think he'd also be amused that it all started because someone thought I couldn't handle a rifle," Sarah replied.
"The best success stories always start with someone being underestimated," Eddie laughed. "The question is what you do when you get the chance to prove them wrong."
Sarah smiled, looking at the awards and certifications now displayed in her home office, evidence of a career transformation that had begun with one perfect shot and continued with the decision to stop hiding abilities that were meant to be shared. "I think I'm finally learning to do the right thing with that chance," she said.